Land ownership has long been one of the most contested issues in the Southern African region. Over the years, through systemic disenfranchisement, colonial powers grabbed land belonging to indigenous communities and handed it over to white settlers. And today, despite independence and various land reform efforts, the imbalance remains stark. In South Africa, Zimbabwe and Namibia, there are attempts to redress the disparity through land reforms. This week on Talk Africa, we examine the goals of these reforms, what they seek to achieve, and the challenges they face. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. And now, to understand the challenges of land reform, we must first look at who owns land today in South Africa, Namibia and Zimbabwe, and how colonial history shaped this reality. In South Africa, white South Africans hold 72% of private farmland, while black South Africans, who make up nearly 80% of the population, own just 4% of the land. South Africa's post-apartheid government set a goal of redistributing 30% of commercial farmland to black ownership by 2014. But by 2023, only about 10% had been transferred. In Zimbabwe, under Robert Mugabe, the government forcibly seized land from white commercial farmers and gave it to black Zimbabweans. The chaotic manner of the seizures triggered severe economic decline. Agricultural production plunged by nearly 60%. Zimbabwe later agreed to pay $3.5 billion in compensation to displaced white farmers for infrastructural losses and is now inviting them back to help revive commercial agriculture. In Namibia, 70% of all agricultural land is still owned by whites, who make up less than 6% of the population. And like Zimbabwe, Namibia opted for a willing buyer, willing seller model, where the government purchases land from white farmers and redistributes it. Only about 27% of land targeted for redistribution had been transferred. Many black Namibians remain landless due to high land prices and limited government funding. And we have a lot to discuss, so let's now bring in our panel of experts. Joining me from Johannesburg via Zoom, Bulelwa Mabasa, Director and Head of the Land Reform Practice. In Cape Town, Willie Ocamp, National Spokesperson of the Democratic Alliance. And in Harare, in Zimbabwe, Rejoice Ngwenya, Executive Director, Coalition for Market and Liberal Solutions. A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining in these discussions. First of all, I want to get your overall view here, and let me start off with you, Willie Ocamp. South Africa has a new law to govern land expropriation. That is the Expropriation Act, which is replacing the apartheid-era Expropriation Act of 1975. What is your overall position on South Africa's land expropriation laws, and why?
The Democratic Alliance is definitely opposed to this act in its current form. The Democratic Alliance is in favor of land reform. Let there be absolutely no mistake. But I think if you look at the intentions of this, when it was a bill that is now an act, if you look at the intentions, it was to expropriate land in the public interest for development purposes. If you want to build a road or a dam or a power line, we know that the requirements are there to enable people to do that. But you've got to look at the history of what happened in South Africa. A few years ago, the ANC government tried to make changes to the constitution, specifically section 25 of our constitution that handles property ownership. And they wanted to change the constitution in such a way that it makes provision for the expropriation of land without compensation. In order to do that, they needed a 2/3 majority in parliament, which they did not get.
Right.
So that was a promise that the ANC made to their voters, and now they tried with this bill and this act now to try and bring at the back door expropriation with no compensation. There are a number of issues that we've got with this bill, and we are opposed to this bill in its current format.
Right. Bulelwa, your thoughts?
I think it's very important to frame what where the Expropriation Act lies in the wider world of land reform. Firstly, in the Expropriation Act is not a land reform mechanism. It is an act that allows a state to be able to acquire property when it needs so for a public purpose and a public interest. Many jurisdictions around the world, and I'm going to name America, they call it eminent domain. I'm going to name the United Kingdom, they call it compulsory acquisition.
Right.
All governments in developed nations have expropriation powers, and that expropriation power is linked with compensation. So it's a misnomer to say that this Expropriation Act deals with land reform. It doesn't. Land reform as a concept in South Africa is dealt with in other pieces of legislation, such as the Restitution Act and such as tenure reform legislation. The Expropriation Act, the only thing that is introduced that we never had before is the fact that the compensation that is payable for expropriation is not brought in line with our constitution. Previously,
right,
the compensation that was payable under the Expropriation Act of 1975 was purely willing buyer, willing seller, or market value. What this new law does is introduces just and equitable compensation, which on its own was already part of our law since the Constitution was promulgated. The other thing that it introduces that is new is that it now stipulates instances where nil compensation may be paid, and those are specified, such as abandoned land or land that is required for, that is owned by the state that is required for service delivery.
Right. So, Bulelwa, just clarify this for us, though, because you're talking about this law introducing just and equitable distribution of land. Is it about expropriation without compensation?
Let me start by saying this. Our Constitution in Section 25 says that expropriation must happen subject to compensation. So the concept of expropriation is already in the Constitution. The government is allowed to expropriate land. The concept of just and equitable compensation, our Constitution says when you have to think about the compensation that is due to somebody who is deprived of land, you've got to take various factors into account. You've got to take the current use of the property into account. You've got to take the history of the acquisition of the property. You've got to take into account the improvements that were done on that land. You've got to take into account the market value of the property. Now, that is what our law, our Constitution says about expropriation. So we already know that the Expropriation Act, as it's been introduced, does not allow whole-scale expropriation without financial compensation. It's actually the opposite. It says expropriation must happen with just and equitable compensation in line with the Constitution. The only instances that are said that are not going to be expropriation without compensation, as I said, is where that land has been abandoned, where that land has caused a safety or health risk, where the landowner has abandoned their responsibility to keep the land safe.
Right.
There's also where there are certain state buildings that are owned by the state, where the state actually doesn't need to hold on to them, that can be expropriated and used.
So let me bring in Rejoice Ngwenya from Harare. What is your overall position on what's going on in South Africa's land expropriation laws?
You know, South Africans have had a brilliant opportunity to learn from our mistakes. You know, we know that it is important to address inequalities, especially in terms of the dispossession that is historical. But there are certain processes that usually end up acrimonious, and they create unnecessary, human relation distortions and contradictions. So it is important that any program that is meant to address inequalities must not necessarily be land-based, because inequalities are a national issue that involve other resources. So we are standing here, having gone through the same process and literally reversing the legislation in its entirety. That we are standing here saying we hope that South Africans are not going to make a mistake that we made to have a land reform that is heavily nuanced with political rhetoric, vengeance, and indiscriminately, corrupt. So the law is once we know that the law is okay, but possibly the implementation might be fraught with distortions, because political interests tend to be overplayed.
So
but otherwise, we have no problem with equalization.
Willie, I come back to you here because this Expropriation Act is replacing an apartheid-era Expropriation Act. Do you, first of all, though, acknowledge that there is need for land reform in South Africa?
Absolutely. Land reform must take place. I've opened up this conversation by saying that. I just would like to come back to what Bulelwa said, and that is the criteria before expropriation with nil compensation can take place. She's right. She mentioned all those things. But the problem that we've got with this act is that it says that it includes those things, but that it is not limited to those things. So it opens up this vague, broad playing field. And we also now have the situation where any level of government official, whether it's provincial, national, or even on local government level, can now do expropriation without compensation or with nil compensation, should it be required. And they does not have a clear reference of what the parameters are for that to take place. So you can have a municipal official that's got a problem with somebody in a specific town, small town in this country, and they says, okay, I'm now going to expropriate your land. We're going to offer you a ridiculous amount. If you do not agree to that, then we can take it without compensation, and you've then going to fight us. That is the practical implications of what can happen. And law should be written not of what will happen, but what can happen, and try to prevent that. There's other issues with this law. Let me give you another example. This law says that when expropriation takes place, and there has been an amount that was agreed, if the expropriation order was given, the transfer of that property to the expropriation authority takes place immediately. And a late payment does not halt that process. So government can come and take my property. We've agreed on an amount. They immediately get ownership of that property, but they can take 1 month, 1 year, 10 years to pay me, and that does not halt the transfer of the property. So it means that I do not have my property anymore. I don't have any money, but that doesn't interfere in the process. That is not constitutional in our opinion.
You mentioned a point that there are no clear parameters on how it should be done. I mean, Bulelwa, you deal with land reform. Are there clear parameters on how the expropriation should be done?
I think this law has more than sufficient safeguards to protect landowners. In fact, I think the burden to prove that an expropriation is necessary is placed more on the state, and I'll tell you why. Before an expropriation happens, the state has to first file a notice of intention to expropriate. And it has to give that notice to all interested parties. Even on land where, for example, there's a mortgage bond, the notification procedures are so inbuilt to ensure that there is enough consultations. I think I counted about 7 steps before any expropriation can happen. Compared to the old 1975 Act, this act is actually more landowner or property rights generous than the old act, because of the numerous stages that are set in order for the state to prove that an expropriation can happen. Another point I'd like to make is that the state actually can't pick and choose what they want to expropriate, can't pick and choose an amount, because the state has to have done enough research. They need reports from the Department of Land Reform to say what is actually happening on that land, why is an expropriation needed. They need reports from other departments like Department of Water. They need reports from a plethora of other government departments before they can actually produce a report that says this is an expropriation. It's not going to be easy for the state to abuse its power, because it bears the onus of showing that something is in the public interest or that something is for a public purpose. And in all those steps, the landowner has sufficient safeguards to be able to object and to even undergo a mediation process that does not need, for example, the inclusion of expensive legal representation. So in my view, this act is actually much more robust in favor of landowners. It actually makes expropriation more difficult than it used to be in the 1975 Act.
Right. So let me come back to you, Rejoice Ngwenya, because I want to look at Zimbabwe's situation in 2000. After launching that land reform program, it justified it as necessary to correct colonial injustices. Now, that move was essential to address historical land dispossession And that process, however, led to economic collapse and a decline in agricultural productivity. Looking back, what key factors contributed to its failure?
The so-called land reform was nuanced with political objectives. In other words, it seems that Mugabe and ZANU-PF were losing control because of the emergence of an opposition party. So they found something convenient in order to remain, holding on to their faithful supporters. So it was the politicized program that had economic objectives, and that was the problem. Secondly,
one of the critical errors that we committed was that the land was allocated without due diligence in terms of the capacity of the beneficiaries. So in other words, if somebody has no capacity to attract the necessary capital, it doesn't matter what size of their hectarage, they were not able to finance their agricultural milestones. And of course, it meant that since the agricultural land in terms of constitution was still owned by the state, the lack of titled ownership gave the beneficiary a certain status of insecurity, and they did not have the zeal and the will to focus on productivity without the fear of losing the property. So if we had corrected the issue of title ownership, and also the issue of depoliticizing and ensuring that the beneficiaries were capacitated, we should have been able to reach our productivity milestones.
Indeed. We're now going to take a short break. Thank you all very much for this lively discussion. When we come back from the break, we'll explore what needs to be done to ensure land reform leads to real economic empowerment of the people. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's now continue with our discussion. Still with me, Bulelwa Mabasa, Willie Okamp, and Rejoice Ngwenya. Let me start off with you, Bulelwa, here. The US and the UK imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe at the time that Zimbabwe implemented its land reform, but it did not pressure Britain to compensate Zimbabwe for colonial land theft. Now, South Africa is again facing potential economic repercussions from the West. Isn't this a double standard in how the West is responding to land reform in Africa?
Yes, because if you look at what it is, for example, that Trump, with the assistance of Elon Musk, have been, objecting to, they're objecting on a basis that is factually incorrect. They have made assumptions that there is a white genocide happening in South Africa, where Afrikaners are being killed, and where there is no room for that. I just want to rectify and clarify misinformation here. Land audits have been done in the past in South Africa. However, they were not reliable. The fact that we don't have information or data that tells us who owns what in South Africa does not detract from the factual basis that says this. We have the 1930 Natives Land Act in South Africa,
right,
that made sure that Black people were not allowed to own land. In fact, Black people were dispossessed of land without compensation. There were vast land confiscations even before 1913, going back to previous centuries. The point that I'm making here is we do not need a land audit to tell us that South Africa still suffers from major land injustice, where land is still owned by the minority of South Africans, and that Black South Africans are in the vast majority of the landless people.
Right.
So I think that is one part that is missing from the Elon Musk Trump narrative. The second narrative is this: South Africa is a country that relies a lot on agricultural production. Our restitution laws, and certainly our expropriation laws, are not geared toward disrupting the economy. In fact, the contrary is true. When people get awarded land for land claims or when land is expropriated,
right,
we do not have laws that say they favor land redistribution over economic productivity or over agricultural productivity. In fact, people like that are given alternative land or they're given financial compensation.
right.
So that's another misinformation that we need to get out of the way, is that land reform is intimately and inextricably linked to support economic growth, to support agriculture. The third point I want to make is actually, contrary to what Trump has said and Elon Musk, food production in South Africa is only in the hands of, I think, 5% of the population. That is a food security risk. We need to ensure that we have commercial farmers who are also Black, that also increase the percentage of those that are responsible for food security. And so it is also a misinformation to say that there is a geared or there is a process in place in South Africa that wants to eliminate farmers. That is not true.
Right.
So when we hear about these things around what the West is doing, or rather the sanctions that are being placed on South Africa is a country that is built on the rule of law.
Right.
We have an independent judiciary, and even the Expropriation Act that we're talking about today is under the very capable and firm eye of the judiciary in terms of its constitutionality and applicability.
And Rejoice, if I may come to you here, what lessons can South Africa learn from Zimbabwe's practice?
You know, when you look at South African Expropriation Act, it's very progressive and looks from this side of the continent, it looks liberal. But the issue of politicization, you know, we know that in 2000, Robert Mugabe was feeling insecure. And we know that given the past election in South Africa, the ANC lost its majority. So they tended to look at the expropriation process as another way of recovering their political clout. Of course, I mean, being pushed by the left of the left, EFF. So the good lesson that they should learn from Zimbabwe is that the system and the processes must be totally depoliticized, and the judiciary should play an arbitration role so that whatever the result of the process is, it retains international credibility in terms of South Africa being viewed as a country that respects the rule of law. Compensation, yeah, it's something that should remain because, look, you don't want to create a land reform program that has a lingering, feeling of grief and vengeance. It must leave every citizen satisfied that the process has been able to fulfill their economic ambitions and aspirations, so that you maintain a reputation, not just local but international reputation, which is able to attract direct investment into the program.
Right. So, Willie, from your end, though, you've talked of the need for land reform. Are there alternative models for land reform that you think could be more effective?
Well, I think firstly, one must realize that land reform does not end the moment that you give land to somebody, to a previous disadvantaged individual. That authority to give land is there, but it should not stop there. In the Western Cape, we have made sure that where land reform took place, those new farmers or new property owners were assisted. You cannot just give him land and then walk away and think your responsibility ends there. We've got various programs in this country that allows us to assist those new farmers to farm and to grow from an upcoming farmer into a commercial farmer in time. And in the Western Cape, we have done that sufficiently and successfully due to our assistance to those farmers afterwards.
Right. So I want to get to your winding up remarks. And let me start off with you, Bulelwa. You talked a lot about the need for just equitable distribution of land. What is the best way forward, though, to balance justice, equality, and economic stability in the proposed land reforms?
I think it's already there in our laws. The Restitution Act says that even where land is valid and it needs to be given to a land community, if that land is going to cause major social disruption, that land cannot be given to those communities. They'd rather communities have a right to opt for alternative land and or for financial compensation. We have thousands of stories that tell us that. So the idea that land reform somehow undermines whether food security or economic development is a misnomer. In my experience, and part of the Presidential Advisory Land Panel, I recommended the concept of land donations, where there are landowners who own land, they can voluntarily donate land that they don't need in order to make profits, where that land can also be used by people that were previously disadvantaged. And the response was overwhelming. I had people approaching me saying, I want my farm workers to actually have equity in the land because they've been working for generations on this land. They've been working there. Unfortunately, we have a trust deficit where even the people that want to donate land are not going to do that if that land is going to be in the name of the state. They want to ensure that it's the people that will benefit. So when we have land policies and legislation actually that can enable that goodwill, because in my view, land reform should be a nation-building project. Land reform is not throwing away people into the sea and replacing them with others. Land reform is how do we use our best assets in our country, which is our land, our minerals, and the skills that come with those that know how to farm, know how to do agriculture, know how to do production. That to me is the true essence of land reform, and that's what must happen in our country.
Right. Willie, your response?
I fully agree that is what needs to take place. Unfortunately, land has become a political playball in this country. And again, I'm referring you to, we know what the objects of a law is and what the objects of this specific law is. But we have heard what our Deputy President said and various other people said that awakens fears in the hearts and minds of landowners currently. We've got to work together to find solutions for the problems that we've got. And from the Democratic Alliance side, we are more than willing to do that. I think our ministers in government have shown that where they work very hard. Where we govern good. And we are definitely committed to make South Africa work, to make land reform in this country work, to make food security in this country work. But most of all, to make sure that our constitution is adhered to at all times. We are there to ensure that economic growth and job creation in this country takes place. And in everything that we are going to do, we're going to ask ourselves whether what we are doing are adhering to those requirements.
Right. Rejoice Ngwenya, I want to get your view as well.
It must be a system that is depoliticized, that is specific productivity milestones, which can be traced downstream. I mean, the value chain of land is not just the land itself, but the productivity that comes with it in order to be able to assume the necessary equity that we need. And of course, finally, it must come with specific titling rights, so that titling can then be used by the beneficiaries as collateral to enhance their capacity to capitalize their acquisitions.
Indeed, thank you all very much for your time on this edition of Talk Africa. Very big thank you to our guests, Bulelwa Mabasa, Director and Head of the Land Reform Practice, Willie Ocamp, National Spokesperson of the Democratic Alliance of South Africa, and Rejoice Ngwenya, Executive Director, Coalition for Market and Liberal Solutions, joining us there from Harare in Zimbabwe. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more of Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, goodbye.